Smita, Syriac is there. Syriac will handle no student coordinator. I think Winnie got some problem now, so Syriac will take this charge as student coordinator. Syriac, can you hear me? Are you there? Better.
Lira, it seems you are mute. If you're speaking something, it's not audible.
Okay, Syriac want to make him co-host.
Can we start now? Because I think it's
Yeah,
already
yeah,
30.
he is about to join. Sorry, Rakesh, can you make Syriac co-host? He wished to join. He want to introduce Smita ma'am.
Done.
Done. Okay, then Syriac, please.
Hello.
Yeah, please.
Good morning, all. Welcome to the second day of the international webinar on migrants and displaced persons amid COVID-19 issues and policy options, jointly organized by the School of International Relations and Politics, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, FLAME University, Pune, GRFDT, New Delhi. This session will be shared by Dr. Smita Tiwari. Attendees can type in their question in the chat box with your name and designation. Now, I invite Dr. Smita Tiwari to chair the session. Ma'am, the session is all yours.
Thank you, Syriac, and very good morning to all of you. On behalf of organizing committee, I would like to welcome you all again, all our distinguished speaker, paper presenters, and all the participants on this day 2 of 3-day international webinar. Yesterday, we had a very fruitful discussion on internal migration and various aspects relating to internal migration. And today, we are all set to discuss issues and challenges relating to international migration. And when we talk of international migration, I think particularly in this present day, when we look at the effect of COVID-19, we are very categorically pointing out to those specific category which are very vulnerable in their existing condition, because there are those who have migrated and settled down in their country of settlement, and over the years they have become resilient to face any kind of crisis or pandemic. But those who are still very vulnerable in their existing crisis is a main section that has been adversely affected. And if I take some reference from yesterday's talk, keynote address from by Dr. Chinmay Tumbe, I think he very aptly mentioned that the difference between internal and external international migration is that while it is a little easier to control international migration, it is very difficult and challenging to control or regulate internal migration. The reason being the exit and entry point at the international level is very known, it's numerous, and it can be well regulated and controlled. But if we look at the other side of the coin, I mean, it is from the authority perspective, but if we look at the migrant perspective, I don't know, I somehow believe that being stranded in an unknown land among unknown people or unknown set of languages, or which is not very familiar, it is very plightful, and it is very challenging for migrants. So a different perspective it can be in terms of international migration. We are witnessing since last couple of months, government of India has taken a huge Herculean task of Vande Bharat mission and taking back lots of stranded Indians back to country. But huge challenges lies ahead, and today we will be looking at the various different aspects like the Vande Bharat mission. If we talk about it, it very categorically say that only those Indians will be coming who are either out of their contract or who have some urgency which won't allow their continuation of living in their land of where they are staying at the present. But there are also those who are in vulnerable condition but who are unable to come back under this. So there are other certain kind of population also who are facing challenges and who do not have this kind of facility so that they can come back to their home. Also, the problem of returning migrants, that how to bring them and how to rehabilitate them. Are they going back to their previous work or will they continue to stay in India? And if they continue to stay in India, how to re-engage them in present situation where economy is going down and unemployment rate is going very high. So all these challenges are there. And also if we look in terms of the Gulf migration, remittances has been a very important aspect. So returning migrants also signals that remittances is going to go down. So these are the challenges, and I think today we have an extremely excellent speaker today who would show some light on these issues relating to international migration. We have Mr. Shabari Nair. He is the Regional Migration Specialist, a Decent Work Technical Support Team for South Asia and India at the International Labour Organization, New Delhi. He provides technical advisory services to 7 countries in the sub-region covering Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And before joining DWT, he was leading ILO's work on a global migration policy, including for intergovernmental negotiations and adoption of Global Compact for Migration, and recently established UN Network on Migration with posting in both ILO headquarters in Geneva and ILO office in the United Nations, New York. He is also a focal point for Asia and Middle East in the labor migration branch. So you see, we have a very specialist. You may get a very first-hand information with his experience. So let me call Mr. Shabari Nair, a person with a contagious energy, I would say, and enthusiasm. And Mr. Shabari Nair, the floor is all yours. So please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Smita. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. Gosh, thanks so much. What a fantastic introduction, Smita. However, I must tell you that I still consider myself to be a student of the migration scenario in general. It is like peeling an onion. The more and more you peel it, the more and more layers you find. And the more layers you find, you begin to understand the complexity of the system that is migration. I wasn't sure how actually to begin this, because I understand that a lot of it is focused with regards to COVID-19 itself. But what we have here is, it is important to recognize that we haven't reached where we are today without a certain historical basis to who we are as people, how we decided to move, and how the global governance on migration influenced these movements, influenced migration governance at large. I'm glad, Smita, I'm very glad that you started off by perhaps even debating Chinmay's point from yesterday, right? Because that is one of the things that came to my mind. I mean, how is it that you can say that internal migration is not as well regulated, or perhaps let's put it the other way around, that international migration is much more well regulated? But do we understand the fact that within the context of international migration, the challenges are so different to what migrants within our country face? Let's not forget, in the case of India, internal migrants or not, they're first and foremost citizens of the country. So therefore, the challenges that somebody faces when they cross international borders are much different. And if I may challenge, even go on to say that perhaps much more difficult to solve and resolve. Right, with that, here's my little background with regards to where I come from. And where I come from is the International Labour Organization. Last year, the ILO celebrated its 100th anniversary. The ILO is officially the third oldest UN organization in the world. Out of the 30-odd international UN organizations within the UN system, the ILO is the third oldest. And in that context, what the ILO has achieved over its 100 years is important for you to also recognize where we are with regards to labor migration as a whole. When the ILO was established in 1919, it came together as a very unique setup within the international organization framework. And why is it unique? It is unique because this is the only organization that brings together three different constituents: governments, employers, and trade unions. So therefore, the voice of the workers, the voice of the employers, and the voice of the policymakers are combined in the way the ILO functions and the way the ILO carries its work. The constitution of the ILO, which was established in 1919, gives the ILO the mandate to look at international migration, particularly in the protection of migrant workers. And in the constitution, it says protecting the rights of workers in countries other than their own. And that was the direct link to the issue of labor migration. So when we say, and everybody says this in any policy conversation, that migration is time immemorial, that the fact that people have always moved, and that was recognized in the constitutional mandate of a UN organization that has lasted 100 years. In fact, when our Director General, Guy Ryder of the ILO, was asked last year during the centenary celebrations about what he would claim or what he would say would be some of the successes of the ILO, he started by saying the very fact that we have lasted 100 years and are still relevant to this day and age is what makes ILO and its mission a success. Now, in the last 100 years to where we are now, so the last time we had a pandemic of such a global scale was in 1918 with the Spanish flu. And even at that time, even when the ILO was created a year later in 1919, I don't think the impacts of the Spanish flu were necessarily the first elements of conversation. Why? Because it was also the end of the First World War. So the effects and the ravages, the consequences of the First World War were more important for a lot of us to keep in mind, to know how we should take things forward from the time the ILO was instituted. So the purpose of it was about social justice. The purpose of it was to provide decent working condition for anybody in the context of a workplace. Now, if you look at the ILO, one of the first things that you will hear about ILO, apart from the fact that it's a tripartite institution, is the fact that it is also a custodian of international labor standards. And I say this, and I am not going to be looking at this entire picture of international migration from just the ILO standpoint, but because it is necessary for us to look at the historical angle, and what better an organization than the ILO to give you that historical perspective. So when we look at international labor standards, in 1919, the first international labor standard that was adopted was with regards to the Convention on Working Hours. This is Convention number 1. ILO, as of this year, 2020, has adopted 190 international labor standards. Now, let me ask you this. If you were a worker, it doesn't matter a migrant worker, it doesn't matter whether you're working within the confines of your own country, the first thing that you will read in a contract is 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And this 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock setup came as a result of the Working Hours Convention and how it has evolved by itself over time. So I wanted to then impress on you the importance of the fact that anything that we as workers or workers in general are subject to has come as a result of international labor standards trickling down from the global level to the national level, and how that coherence between national and international labor standards is so important when we speak about the governance of migration. But very soon, there were other international labor standards that were being set up. Now, this was specifically in the context of migrant workers. So in 1949, already 2 years after the independence of India, the first Migration for Employment Convention was set up. This is convention number 97. So within 20 years of the ILO's existence, 97 conventions were adopted, and the 97th convention was on migration for employment. A few years later, in 1975, the ILO adopted another convention called the Migrant Workers Convention, the C-143, convention number 143. That convention specifically built on the Migration for Employment Convention that was adopted in 1949. So between 1949 and 1975, you had two international labor standards that specifically spoke about how labor migration should be governed from an international perspective. Come to 1991, we then had the UN Convention, the very famous UN Convention for the rights, protection of the rights of migrant workers and members of their families. This is the 1991 convention. Between these three conventions together is called the triumvirate of migration and the labor standards that is anchored between these three conventions. Along the way, ILO came up with a number of guidelines. And when I say ILO came up with a number of guidelines, it doesn't mean that some people from within the ILO sat together and somewhere in Geneva at the ILO headquarters, scribbled their ideas from their head down and decided what should be these ILO conventions and guidelines. No, these are negotiated conventions. The ILO has a participation of 187 UN member states. They came together along with workers and employers, negotiated these conventions and put it forward. So it's important for us to recognize that a lot of these standards are important to where we have gotten today. And I'll come to that to see maybe that's when we need to ask ourselves the questions of where we are now. COVID has affected us. We're now living in a world that is riddled with a pandemic in all its facets, whether as a health crisis, a jobs crisis, a livelihoods crisis, a wages crisis, and how it has brought us all together to these conversations that we've been having over the last 7 months. Going back now, one of the first conversations that you will hear at the policy global level is the 1994 ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development. Till then, the issue of migration was very limited to these conversations within standard setting. So the standard setting conversations was where we had conversations on migration, the fact that migrant workers need to be protected. However, there were not many policy discussions. So the Cairo Plan of Action, as they called it, it was held in Egypt in 1994, brought together a number of UN member states together to discuss what we should do with regards to migration, but in the context of population and development. Because this is about movements of people, population movements, and it was important for us to take it from there. And then came after 94, there were many chapters in the ICPD Plan of Action. One of those ICPD Plan of Action chapters was on human rights. There were a number of chapters. There was a chapter on development. There was a chapter on human rights. The issues of migrant workers fell under the chapter on human rights, not just migrant workers, but migrants in general. Moving forward then, in 2000, Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, decided that it was time to leave a legacy that spoke for itself about how the world needs to achieve a certain development perspective going forward. And that is how the MDGs came to place. They always say that the MDGs was written in the basements of the UN headquarters in New York and then was adopted in the 37th floor of the UN headquarters by the then Secretary General and put forward to the member states. It had 8 goals, it had 18 targets, and it had 49 indicators. Go back to the MDGs and you will not see a single reference to migration. So that is the perspective that we came for. But why did we not see a single reference to migration? Because when they referred to the ICPD plan of action in 2000, they saw that the development chapter, which set the basis for the MDGs, one of the bases for the MDGs, did not have a reference to migration. Also because in 2000 at the time, we were still arguing about migrants and how they should be protected. Governments were still pointing fingers at each other. The world was not necessarily together in the context of migrants and migrant workers in general. That was in 2000 with the establishment of the MDGs. But then the Secretary General realized way too soon that this was not good for an issue that really transcended the world like nothing else, which is the issue of migration, and therefore instituted a global commission for international migration. This global commission came to place in 2003. And between 2003 and 5, the global commission comprising of a number of countries, not every UN member state, but they all came together, quite a few of these countries, through their commissioners, as they call them, and they sat together and for 2 years debated and put forward a set of recommendations. The first recommendation that they put forward was, they said, we need to have a concrete discussion on migration within the United Nations. Voila, that was the recommendation that led to the first the UN high-level dialogue on international migration and development in 2006. Now, I wanted to impress on you about how the global perspectives then translated at the regional and the national level. And I'll come to that in a bit. So when we talk about these global perspectives and when we have issues pertaining to migration being discussed at the UN level, at the first UN high-level dialogue on international migration and development, you can imagine how controversial that must have been. Why? Because when you walk into the UN, you will see automatically that the European countries form a bloc, the bloc of the EU, the European Union. The African countries come together as the Africa group. Asia, not as much. In fact, rarely do we come together as a group. We have our own problems, and that also affects in the way Asia sees migration. The group of Latin American and Caribbean countries, GRULAC, in Latin America came together, and they discussed migration in the context of a joint force, a joint grouping of Latin American and Caribbean countries. There was even a Western European and others group, and this group included North American countries like United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all of them come together. So what happens is the moment we take a conversation on migration into the United Nations, conversations become group focused. They become focused with regards to how groups put themselves forward. That is when things become much more sensitive, because suddenly the group mentality is they are not taking care of our people, or they are constantly sending their people to our countries. It becomes along those lines, and it doesn't help the situation necessarily. So therefore, the then first appointed special representative of the Secretary General on international migration, Peter Sutherland, at the time said, we need to have this discussion within the UN, but we need to also have a discussion outside the UN on international migration. And that is how the Global Forum on Migration and Development came into existence. Now, all of these are processes. And a lot of people would say, yeah, but Shabari, okay, this is process. How does it necessarily link into what migrant workers are going through? But it is important to recognize that there is no substance without keeping in mind the process and how things came forward. From 2007 onwards, we've had global forums on migration and development. And then in 2015, we had the multilateral agenda that was truly the spirit of bringing everybody together. 193 UN member states came together to unanimously endorse the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, in 2015. Now, the SDGs were supposed to have been built on the MDGs. So within 15 years, what was previously 8 goals in the MDGs became 17 goals in the SDGs. What was previously 14 targets in the 8 goals, 14 targets and 48 indicators became a question of bringing it together in 17 goals, 169 targets, and 252 global indicators. So within 15 years, we saw the world changing. We saw the recognition of the importance of having as many aspects as possible within the SDGs. And now migration was peppered throughout the SDGs. Every aspect of the SDGs spoke about migration, whether it was in the context of decent work and employment and the protection of migrant workers, or whether it was in the context of reducing inequalities between countries and therefore facilitating labor migration, whether it was in the context of reducing remittance cost, whether it was in the context of disaggregating data by migrants and their status. And these are all important elements that came out in the SDGs. Now, the SDGs, a lot of people would say, for me, certainly, it's the MDGs on steroids, right? The SDGs is the Sistine Chapel of multilateralism. A lot of people would say that Da Vinci's masterpiece, Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece, one of his masterpieces certainly is the Sistine Chapel. And for me, the Sistine Chapel of multilateralism is the SDGs. That's what makes the SDGs so special, because it talks about development and how migration contributes to development. But why was that important? It was important because now countries started saying, well, maybe let's not look at migration as just an issue from security and legal perspectives. Let us also look at migration from the perspective of development, the fact that migrants are contributing to the development of our countries. And finally, after the SDGs, came in 2018, the Global Compact for Migration. So the Global Compact for Migration established and brought together a whole group of countries initially for what we call the consultation phase. It was over a 2-year period. Then came the negotiations. The moment the negotiations started, one country withdrew, the United States. For their own reasons, they withdrew from the negotiations of the Global Compact for Migration and said that they will stay away from it. That was the beginning of what we started to see as being a sensitive issue once again on migration within the UN. But the difference is, in those conversations on migrations and in those consultations of the Global Compact for Migration, finally, 152 member states out of the 193 adopted the Global Compact for Migration, including India and all the other countries in South Asia. This is a step forward because not only is this the first officially negotiated compact or first officially negotiated document on migration, but it's also the first officially negotiated document on migration within the United Nations auspices. In the context, taking it forward then, how was it seen? A lot of the issues pertaining to the Global Compact was also that this is non-binding, it is informal, it is voluntary, it is action-oriented. Fine, it is all of this. However, there was a sense of moral binding associated to it. that governments came together and adopted it. The 152 governments that adopted it on the basis that it was morally binding. That is the global perspective. Today, when we look at the issue of numbers of migrants, we always refer to the numbers that were released last year, 2019. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs released the official numbers as per the 2019 estimates of migrants in the world. Total number of migrants in the world, 272 million. Now, the 272 million includes all kinds of people who have moved across international borders. Who are these people? They include refugees. They include internationally displaced people. They include people who have moved, members of families who have moved with migrants. So therefore, it was important for the ILO to now dissect that figure. 272 million international migrants. Okay, how many of those are migrant workers? The 2018 ILO global estimates, which were released in 2018, states that there are 164 million migrant workers. 164 million out of 272. That is about 60% of the global migrant population are people who have moved for work, who have moved for employment. Now, within that context, we have to now recognize that there are two sets of UN organizations that put their things forward. The first was UNDESA, the second was ILO. The third, always when we speak about migration and we want to talk about how migration has contributed to development, we talk about remittances, which is the one international organization that has brought this forward always, the World Bank. And the World Bank said that in 2019, remittances amounted to about $700 billion, over $700 billion. While on the other hand, within a year's time, this year in 2020, they are going to see a reduction of over 20% in remittances. So that means COVID has played a very important role in how remittances has been affected. This means altogether, I have now mentioned three organizations: ILO, UNDESA, and World Bank. But then where does this leave us with IOM, the International Organization for Migration? I mentioned about the UN Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. That is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Where does that leave us on the movement of children? UNICEF. We know that close to half the migrant population in the world are women. How does UN Women come to play on these issues? Whereas we know that migration is a development contributor. How does the United Nations Development Program come into this picture? The reason why I mention this is where you need to recognize that the reason for the fragmentation of global governance is also because of the fact that not one UN agency or not one international organization deals with these issues. There are a number of organizations, a number of stakeholders, and a number of voices that come to play in the conversation on international migration, and particularly in the context of labor migration. Now, that brings us to the regional perspectives. I mentioned about 164 million migrant workers. How many of them come from just South Asia? Close to 50 million. Which are the 6 countries that have this big population of migrant workers? Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka. Those are your 6 countries that have close to 50 million migrant workers. 50 million out of 164. So may I say then, 1/3 of the global migrant worker population come from just South Asia, making South Asia the biggest hotspot for labor migration in the world. Let us also not forget, however, that a lot of these migration movements are not just between South Asia and the Middle East or West Asia. It's not just between South Asia and Southeast Asia, like Singapore, Malaysia, and other countries, but it's also movement of migrant workers within South Asia. Let us not forget that India and Nepal has an open border, and we perhaps don't recognize how the impact of COVID on Indians in Nepal and Nepalis in India. Let us not forget that COVID has impacted the border between Bangladesh and India and the role of Indian migrant workers and Bangladeshi migrant workers in each other's countries. Let us not forget that Pakistan is still the second largest host of refugees in the world. The fact that Bangladesh is the 5th largest country that hosts refugees in the world. So South Asia is certainly a region that is a hotspot for mobility in all its facets. And it's important for us to recognize that as we understand and digest information pertaining to migration within our region and how we are situated. Every conversation on migration at the regional level in South Asia has been very diverse. Take, for instance, SARC. When was the SARC established? SARC was established in 1985. But when was the first time migration was brought within the SARC agenda? 2014. So it took almost 30 years for SARC to discuss migration. Why? Because of the sensitivity of migration and the movement of people within our own region. I mean, take, for instance, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They have now a declaration for the protection of workers within ASEAN. That is not something that SARC has yet been able to achieve, but we certainly hope that that will happen in the coming years, given the fact that SARC has at least acknowledged the importance of migration. But when it did acknowledge it in 2014, Nepal was the chair of SARC. And when they acknowledged the importance of migration within the SARC agenda, they said that it was important to keep in perspective the fact that this was only about migrant workers who were outside the region. This was not about migrant workers within SARC, but those migrant workers from SARC going outside the region. Great. Now, if that is the case, and if we want to focus on that, between 2014 and now, this year, 2020, there has been almost no heads of state summit of SARC till Honorable Prime Minister Modi called for a heads of state meeting at the break of the pandemic in March. And between March and May, there were 2 heads of state summits of SARC. And in that conversation, they established the SARC COVID Fund. But we have to ask ourselves, has the SARC COVID Fund, which India was the first to initiate and lead, and India contributed $10 million to that COVID fund, did that necessarily go back to that conversation on migration, which spoke about the protection of migrant workers outside the region? So was the SARC able to come together along those lines? And these are questions that I will leave you with so that you can also think about it as you go through the day in the conversations, in your own conversations on international migration. Within the SARC, again, because there was these dynamics, it was important that other regional consultative processes came together. And what were these regional consultative processes? In 2003, they established the Colombo Process, which brought together 12 countries from South and Southeast Asia. It has India and China in that group. India and China are equally big destination countries, but they came together, these 12 countries, as sending countries. Do you think it would have been easy for these countries to talk about migration if they are also there as destination countries? Not necessarily. That is in the context of SARC. We then had the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, which was established in 2008. The Abu Dhabi Dialogue brought together all the Colombo Process countries with countries from the Middle East, the Gulf countries and Malaysia from Southeast Asia. That was an important conversation as well, and that was an important collaboration between countries of origin and destination. Now, how has the Abu Dhabi Dialogue been used and leveraged in the context of those who have been affected by COVID? So are those regional conversations strong enough to change the way migrants have been affected, or let's say detrimentally affected as a result of COVID? And that is a question that you need to ask yourself over the course of this day's conversations. A third point that I want to focus on is going back to the Global Compact for Migration. The Global Compact for Migration was based on 10 guiding principles. These 10 guiding principles are along the lines of, the first, it said it should be people-centered. The second, it said it should be based on international cooperation. The third was that it should be based on national sovereignty, that we need to keep in mind that countries have their own sovereign borders, and therefore it should respect that. The fourth was that it should be based on the rule of law. The fifth, that it contributes to sustainable development. The sixth, that it was a human rights-based approach document. The seventh was that it had a gender-responsive agenda. The eighth was that it was child-sensitive. The ninth was that it was based on a whole-of-government approach. And the 10th was that it was a whole-of-society approach. All of these 10 guiding principles laid the foundations for the Global Compact for Migration. So if we were to look at it along those lines now and come to COVID specifically, keeping in mind the historical perspectives, keeping in mind the fact that all these governments came together for the first UN high-level dialogue, instituted the Global Forum on Migration and Development, adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and then adopted the Global Compact for Migration, how has all of this then translated to the regional level with the establishment of the Colombo Process, the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, the recognition of migration within the SARC agenda, then going down to the national levels. So how has COVID impacted? COVID has impacted people in many different ways, particularly migrant workers. As of June, the ILO reports, we have something called as the ILO COVID Monitor. And it will be good for somebody to consider doing a research on the development of the ILO first edition COVID Monitor to where we are now, which is the 6th edition. Go through each one of these ILO COVID monitors and see how each one of these monitors has constantly exacerbated the issues and stressed on the fact that workers are being affected because of COVID. And so in the 5th edition of the COVID monitoring report, the ILO COVID monitoring report, it said that the Arab countries, particularly in West Asia, the ones in the Middle East, were struggling and they will face job losses of up to 8 million people. There are 17.5 million migrant workers from just India. Out of these 17.5 million migrant workers, over 9 million are just in the 6 Gulf countries. So if the Middle East was going to lose 8 million jobs, who are the people you think that will be first losing their jobs? The people who will be first losing their jobs would be those migrant workers. They will be the first to be fired and the last to be hired. Now, within this context, we saw a lot of people returning. India, till now, has returned in their Vande Bharat mission, which Smita spoke about right at the beginning, has returned in the repatriation exercise close to 1.8 million people. So that is about 18 lakh Indians have returned, most of them from the Gulf countries. Do your number crunching on that, and it will be interesting to see how many people who have returned from the Gulf have returned with non-payment of wages, for instance. Why? Because companies were not having business. When they were not having a business, they couldn't pay their workers. Who was the worker that was once again first affected with the non-payment of wages? Migrant workers. And these were the migrant workers who were returning to their countries of origin. A lot of this conversation also focused on reintegration. When we get into issues relating to reintegration, a lot of these migrant workers coming back were coming back to a situation in their own countries where the job markets were down, where the job markets were disintegrated. How do we expect these people to then reintegrate within the labor market? But at the same time, let's not forget, there is a labor reintegration and then there is a social reintegration. A lot of these migrant workers were perceived to be the carriers of infection. If they are perceived to be the carriers of infection, how exactly was the government going to socially reintegrate these people? And let's not forget, at the end of the day, we are also people in India who don't necessarily care about how workers in our own system are treated. there is no dignity of labor necessarily. This is something that the trade unions have always spoken about. So if there is no dignity of labor, how do you expect these people to be both labor-wise and socially reintegrated into their own countries of origin? A lot of these people are coming back with tremendous skills. What kind of skills are they going to be using in these countries? In fact, yesterday, I was in a conversation with a whole group of officials from the Government of India, Ministry of External Affairs, and it was very interesting to hear one particular Ministry of External Affairs official based in the Middle East saying that it was not going to be easy for migrant workers who lost their job in a country in the GCC to now get the same kind of salary or the same kind of a job in the country of origin. So there is that acknowledgement, and we need to recognize that. Again, in the case of migration, particularly in times of COVID, one of the first things that was recognized was, my gosh, there are so many irregular migrant workers. In fact, the Sri Lankan Foreign Secretary in a meeting a few months back in July first said, we have now started recognizing that our migrant workers who are irregular in the country of destination have started coming out of the woodworks. Why was that important? Because it doesn't matter whether you're irregular or regular, but if you can get COVID, you will get COVID. The COVID is not going to see whether you have a passport, whether you have a work permit or not. If you need to get it, you will get it, right? And therefore, it was important for countries of destination to treat anybody, irrespective of whether they had COVID or not. Otherwise, the conversation still becomes about you versus me, us versus them, those who are infected, those versus those who are not infected, and so on. And it was important to not go into that kind of a conversation, because if one person is not safe, or if one person is infected, then you can be guaranteed that every person around that area would also not be safe and is prone to infection. The issue regarding international legal frameworks. I mentioned about these conventions. Did you know that the migration conventions, the 3 migration conventions that I mentioned, ILO and the UN Convention of Migrant Workers, are the least ratified conventions? In fact, even India, being a big sending country, has not ratified any of these 3 conventions. It is therefore important for us to also recognize the fact that if we have not considered these labor standards within our international framework at the national level, then we are still not going to be able to provide the necessary access to justice. The necessary bilateral cooperation between countries are not going to be strengthened if these legal standards and these labor frameworks are not necessarily kept in mind. And it doesn't matter then whether it is COVID or not COVID, it's business as usual. And finally, I'll leave you with this one thought. Yesterday, we heard a lot of perspectives with regards to internal migration in the context of India. Now let's think about it along these lines. How many of these migrant workers, I remember that Chinmay put up a map that said that most international and internal migrant workers now are coming from 5 or 6 sending states in the north of India. UP, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Rajasthan. These are the biggest sending states for migrant workers from India. These are also the biggest sending states for international migrant workers from India. And if that is the case now, the same set of migrant workers from the Gulf are going back to that village in Bihar or UP or Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, and the same set of internal migrant workers from those very same villages are going back. How exactly would be the result? What would be the result when the 2 migration experiences clash? And the reason I mention this is because at one point we all heard about the clash of civilizations. I think what we will now see is a clash of migration cultures, and the clash of migration cultures that may lead into conversations that are much more sensitive even within our own country. So it's not that I want to leave you with a negative perspective, but what I want you to keep in mind is the fact that any conversation on migration, whether it is internal or international, should be looked at from a holistic perspective. And a holistic perspective is what will help us take forward the issue of migration in a much more comprehensive manner. Smita, thanks so much. Thank you very much to GRFDT, to MG University, and to Flames for bringing me and giving this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to any further questions or perspectives that you may have. Thanks so much. Smita, I think you're on mute.
Hello, ma'am. You're in mute. Oh. Hello, ma'am. Can you unmute yourself?
We can hear. We can hear.
Shabari sir, there is a question. I guess there is a technical delay from the chair's side. So shall we move on to the?
Hello. I'm sorry. I think there was some technical glitch. I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. You are audible.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shabari Nair, for your elaborated presentation, and I think it was very, very useful in terms of understanding the evolution and of various labor laws, what we have today, and the also evolution of GCM. And thank you very much for providing insightful shades on the mobility within and outside the South Asian countries. So I'm sure there must be a lot of questions and people must be waiting to get more interaction from you. So I would ask Syriac to put on some questions which he had collected from the chat box. Syriac, please. Hello? Syria?
Okay. Am I audible, sir? Sir, there is one question. Hello, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sir. There is one question from Mr. Thambi Nagarjuna. Greetings to the ambassador of ILO. As a founder member of and permanent member from 1922 to 97 years, whether India has benefited in its full length, at least to the tri-party and 5 fundamental thumb rules. And he also wished to mention about the COVID wage theft, especially by Middle East and internal Indian migration, how ILO will compensate.
Right. Thanks, thanks, Syriac. Namaskaram, Thambi sir. How are you? Hope you're keeping well. Good to hear from you as always. Thambi sir, unlike how you have posed that question, I don't necessarily see this as a negative perspective. Look, the government of India was one of the founding members of the ILO. It is one of the 10 founding members of the ILO that was instituted in 1919. So, you know, there is absolutely no question of India's role in how the ILO works and how ILO is regarded as an important organization within the UN system as far as India is concerned. Now, there are 8 fundamental conventions among those labor laws, that the 190 that I spoke about, 8 which look at various issues. For instance, the abolition of forced labor. For instance, issues pertaining to a minimum age convention or abolition of child labor, for instance. However, India has not ratified 2 of those fundamental conventions. And this is regarding particularly the freedom of association and collective bargaining, that is the trade union conventions. I while fully recognizing the fact that India has not necessarily adopted or signed or ratified those conventions, it is important to recognize that we are also the one country, as far as India is concerned, which has 11 central trade unions, more than any other country, as far as South Asia is concerned. It is therefore, and trade unions here have had an important role to play right from the freedom movement to where we are now in terms of workers' rights. Let us not forget that 90% of people within the Indian economy work in the informal sector. And if that is the case, and if people are working, so many people, this is 90%, are working within the informal sector, how exactly can trade unions bring them under their fold? And I know trade union colleagues have been having conversations on this over a number of years now. But so this is not only about one or the other stakeholder. It is important to keep in mind that the government, the employers, and the trade unions have to find a joint answer to these questions. So I don't necessarily take away the fact that India, the government of India, or the trade unions and the employers of India have an important role to play in these conversations. These things are not going to happen overnight. I'm much more convinced about the fact that when I see a lot of these conversations now being had in a joint manner, we can necessarily look at it from a positive angle. Let us not forget again, I'm not saying that everything is great. The adoption of the 4 labor codes now in India, we have had trade unions who have constantly said that they were not done in full consultation with the trade unions. And I know that conversations like these will continue. So it is a constant trial. Certainly sometimes at the cost of migrant workers and their lives itself, but it is something that we need to have constantly. We need to keep these dialogues open. When you speak about wage theft, this is not something new. We have always seen this. Even before COVID, when we ask migrant workers, what are the initial problems that you always face? They will tell you, sir, I was promised 900 riyals and now I'm being paid only 500 riyals. Sir, I signed one contract here in India before I left. When I reached there, I have signed another contract where my wage is shown as lesser. So this is a problem without COVID as well. So this is not something that I would attribute only to COVID. But what COVID has done is it has exacerbated the situation. It has made it much more difficult. And I know that a lot of trade unions, a lot of governments as well, a lot of employers are also discussing this. I'll give you an example again. Yesterday, in that conversation that I was referring to, it was made very clear that in a lot of cases, the government of India's embassies in the different Gulf countries are making sure that migrant workers are getting their wages paid before they come or after they come. The government of India's embassies in the different countries are following up with the employers and the governments in countries of destination. So I'm not fully pessimistic about the way things are. I do think, however, there is a long way to go.
There are a few more questions. The next question is from Rajashekar Shabari. Is any preconditions done to GCC by ILO regarding domestic workers' rights and their labor laws implementation? Many Andhra Pradesh and Telangana people are migrating as domestic workers. Is there any statistics available with ILO?
No, thanks. Rajshekar sir, thank you very much for that question. Certainly, there are the issue of domestic workers is very, very important. As I mentioned, in fact, in the GCC alone, there are over 4 million women, and most of these women migrant workers are in the domestic work sector. Now, if we look at the context of the kind of reforms that have been put in place, a number of reforms have come to place in the Gulf countries. I'll give you an example. Perhaps the best example is the recent labor reforms in Qatar. These labor reforms in Qatar have instituted a minimum wage for all migrant workers. That is 1,000 Qatari riyals. Now, this 1,000 Qatari riyals does not apply just to male migrant workers in the construction sector, for instance, but it also applies to women domestic workers as well. This 1,000 riyals is just the basic pay plus issues regarding accommodation and food is extra on top of this 1,000 riyals basic pay. So I want to say that certainly a lot of the Gulf countries, the UAE, I know, has also instituted a certain decree in the context of better protecting domestic workers in the country, migrant domestic workers. Now, however, I do want to turn the issue back to the country of origin when it comes to domestic workers. So I heard recently, you do know that in India, we have a protectionist law for the migration of women. Women cannot migrate unless they are 30 years of age for domestic work, right? Below the age of 30, they cannot migrate. And when they do migrate for domestic work, they get what they call the ECR stamp, Immigration Check Required stamp on their passports. Now, the funny thing is, and this was again in the conversation yesterday that I heard, that a number of recruitment agents are now trying to push domestic workers to migrate women after the age of 50. If an Indian national migrates over the age of 50, then it automatically means that they get an ECNR passport, that is immigration check not required. Now, this means that the issue of recruitment of migrant women domestic workers is where I would give the first priority to. I understand that the labor reforms in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries are equally important, but I also think that we need to turn that focus to how things are being done in the countries of origin, specifically in countries like India. Otherwise, we will never be able to protect them. Let's remember that the spectrum of protection is not just at the country of destination. It starts from the country of origin. And this spectrum needs to be looked at in a coherent manner. Thank you.
The next question is from Mr. Jamilu Raibu from Bayero University, Kano, Nigeria. His question is how to reconcile the clash of migration, as you mentioned.
Right, thanks, Jamilu. Good to hear from a brother from Africa. Look, the clash of migration that I spoke about is not anything else but the specificity about the clash of internal migration culture versus the international migration culture, and those who are returning back to their countries of origin from international side, and those who are returning back to their communities of origin from the internal side. Look, there is no one straight answer to this. It's a number of issues. For instance, who takes care of the issue of international labor migration in Nigeria? I suppose the Ministry of Labor has an important role to play. But in the case of India, for instance, the international labor migration angle is looked at by the Ministry of External Affairs. When an international migrant worker comes back to their country, they are no more an international migrant worker. Now they are just an Indian citizen. Or if they come back to Nigeria, they are a Nigerian citizen, full stop. Then who is supposed to play an important role in their labor integration? The Ministry for Labor. When an internal migrant worker who is moving from one part of India or one part of Nigeria to another part of Nigeria, when they move, who is supposed to look after their work-related aspects? It is the Ministry of Labor. So therefore, I would say that the Ministry of Labor, the role that the Ministry of Labor has to play has to be elevated. It has to look at all aspects of migration, right from international to internal, because it is about migration for work. It is about labor migration. And that is important to keep in mind. So that is one way to avoid this clash of migration cultures. The second thing that we need to look at is this. A lot of people from India, for instance, who are moving out, I told you that 90% of the people within the Indian economy are in the informal sector. How exactly would you be able to ensure that the people who are moving from the informal sector can be fairly recruited? Because let's not forget, these are people who don't have contracts with their employers. Now, these are the very same people from these informal sector work who are moving for international migration. How can you ensure the fair recruitment of such people? But the reason why that is important is because that fair recruitment applies to both domestic workers and to international migrant workers. And if we can ensure fair recruitment of these people, irrespective of what sector of economy they are coming from, then we can ensure that the migration scenario of whether it is internal migration or international migration is viewed in a coherent manner. So that's two answers or two steps that I can tell you, and there are more. Certainly the one with regards to the whole of society approach, the role of trade unions, the role of civil society organizations, the role of employers are very important to consider how exactly these clashes between the migration cultures can be avoided. Thank you.
So the next question is from Professor V. Matthew Kurian, Mahatma Gandhi University. In the 21st century, labor is pursued as a mere commodity to be regulated by market forces. In this review, do you think ILO can discharge its functions effectively?
Right. Thanks so much, Matthew sir. Thank you for that question. Look, labor is perceived to be a commodity. You're right, and that is certainly the case today. In fact, in the context of recruitment that I was mentioning about earlier, now we have a huge supply of workers from our countries of origin, while at the same time, we are seeing perhaps a demand where the employers decide who they want to pick. This was not the case 4 decades back or 5 decades back, 40, 50 years back. It was different when a lot of migrant workers were in demand much more than the supply. So when the supply increases more than the demand, you can be sure that this is where the difficulties with regards to how migrant workers move and that the commodity that you mentioned will happen. The commodification of migrant workers will happen. However, I do believe that this is not just because of the market forces. I also believe that this is because of market forces in countries of destination, but this is also because of the kind of situation we have at home. For instance, in a lot of our countries, there is no decent work positions that we are able to take in our own countries. Why are people moving in the first place? They're moving because they're forced to move. And when they're forced to move, that is because they don't have the opportunity for decent work in their own countries of origin. So can we focus on that first? However, I'll give you an example. A few years back, I think in 2015 or 16, the government of Nepal instituted something called as the free visa, free ticket policy. They said that any migrant worker who is recruited from Nepal should not pay for their ticket or visa. It should be paid by the employer. But the moment they instituted that, the first thing the employers in the destination country said, they said, we will not recruit from Nepal in that case. And the second thing that happened was the countries of origin, that is from the countries of origin in other countries in South Asia, they raised their hand and said, that's fine. You can recruit from India, or you can recruit from Bangladesh, or you can recruit from Sri Lanka, because we don't have such a policy. The problem, therefore, is also about pushing people. And the more you push people, the more they will end up being commodities. So this is something that we as the ILO are trying to address. We're trying to look at decent work at home first, so that people are not forced to move. And that is an important role that the ILO has to play in the context of labor migration as a whole. I hope that answers your question, Matthew sir. Thank you.
Sir, there are a lot of more questions are there, but
we don't have time.
We don't have time, so we will conclude the question answer session with our chair's question. Our chair has a question towards you, so I'll hand it over to Dr. Smita Tiwari.
Well, thank you, Sariak, and let me take the benefit of being a chair, and I will ask just a brief question, brief insight from you. It has been very interesting throughout. Since we have been talking about the people who are coming back through this Vande Bharat, and I have heard the news that many countries in the Gulf are coming up with this quota system, but I have already Kuwait has announced like 50% of quota for Indians or something sort of. So, and we know that India, particularly South Asian population, constitute a huge chunk of population in the Gulf countries. So how do you see this new emerging ecosystem, if we may use the term, like it is also going to affect remittances, and it is also creating a huge challenge in terms of rehabilitating those who are coming back. So how would you address this as a South Asia as a region?
Thanks, Smita. Very important question. In fact, I know that when Kuwait instituted the quota system, or when they said that they are going to now introduce this quota system for migrant workers in Kuwait, almost every day during the question answer session in the Ministry of External Affairs, this was raised as a question by some journalist or the other. There are 1 million, over 1 million workers, migrant workers from just India in Kuwait. So if Kuwait says that only 15% of the Indian workforce can be in Kuwait, that means over 800,000, over 8 lakh Indian migrant workers in Kuwait have to come back. All right. That is one way of looking at it. So you can imagine if 8 lakh Indians are just going to descend tomorrow from Kuwait, how is the country ready to look at the issue? I mean, we have to keep in mind that we are still following a 1983 Immigration Act in the country. We don't necessarily, as of now, I know that the Ministry of External Affairs and the government of India is revising the bill or having a conversation on the revised bill of the 1983 Immigration Act. And this immigration bill will hopefully be endorsed within this year or the next. Now, if that is the case, we have to first think about, if that is the case, that is so many people are going to come back, let's think about what Kuwait's perspectives will be. If we are talking about a population in Kuwait, there is a population of about 4.5 million people, over 4 million people. Out of that, majority are migrant workers or expatriate population, right? Close to 85% of that population is expatriate. If that is the case, and so many people have to come back, who is going to do the jobs that?
Yeah, that is also very valid.
Who is going to do the jobs in Kuwait of building these buildings? Who is going to do the domestic work in these countries? Will the Kuwaitis themselves do it? I don't know. I mean, it's possible, right? But let us be realistic about this. That is not the case. There will always be a demand for such workers. Now, Kuwait instituted the quota system, but did we see 800,000 people coming back? Did we see 800,000 people from Kuwait losing their jobs and coming back? No, not yet. Because it will be done, if it is going to be implemented, it has to be done first by understanding what the current labor market scenario in Kuwait is before they send these people back. They have to first take into consideration how many of these people will be replaced by the local Kuwaiti population. So there are a lot of those elements that speak to it. It's not going to be easy to just have so many people come back,
Exactly.
because the labor market forces in the country of destination demand something totally different.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shabari Nair. And I would like to invite Sedek for a formal vote of thanks. Sedek, over to you.
Hello, sir, ma'am. I take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude towards Mr. Shabari Nair for his excellent presentation, excellent and wonderful presentation. I must say that. And I thank Dr. Smita Tiwari from GRFDT New Delhi during this session wonderfully. And I extend my gratitude towards all attendees who asked relevant questions so that Dr. Shabari Nair can elaborate his presentation onto many relevant other areas. Thank you. And the next session will begin shortly after a break of 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hello. Hello, Syria. Should we start?
I'm almost all the participants are ready so that we can begin.
Have they joined? All the participants joined?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so
I think so.
you would be starting?
Yes, ma'am. Start right now. Okay, good morning to all. Welcome to the third technical session of the international webinar on migrants and displaced person amid COVID-19 issues, challenges, and policy options, jointly organized by the School of International Relations and Politics, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, FLAME University, Pune, and GRFDT, New Delhi. This session will be shared by Dr. Smita Tiwari, GRFDT, New Delhi. Attendees can type in their questions in the chat box with your name and designation. Now, I invite Dr. Smita Tiwari to share the session. Ma'am, the session is all yours.
Thank you, Syriac. And again, very good morning to all of you, and welcome to this third academic session of this 3-day international webinar on migration and displaced person amid COVID-19 issues, challenges, and policy options. Today, we are focusing on various perspectives on international migration, and we just had a very engaging and interesting a keynote address by Mr. Shabari Nair, and we look forward for similarly engaging and exciting presentations which are lined up. I think 6 presentations we are having in this session. And because we are paucity of time, I will not take much long. I'll just announce the first presentation is being made by Mr. Raju John and Mr. V. Matthew Kurian. And the topic, Mr. Raju John, they are assistant professor of Basilius College, Kottayam, and Mr. Matthew Kurian is a joint director, K.N. Raj Center, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. And they would be presenting on COVID-19 and Kerala's immigration scenario and overview, which sounds very, very interesting. So please, Mr. Raju John and Mr. V. Matthew Kurian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Am I audible to all? Hello, am I audible to all?
Yes, you are. Please continue.
Oh, thank you, madam. Good morning to all of you, respected chair, other dignitaries, fellow presenters, and friends. Before presenting, let me thank the organizers of this international webinar, especially Lirar sir, for giving us an opportunity to share our views on this prestigious international event. The title of our presentation is COVID-19 and Kerala's immigration scenario and overview. So I will be presenting the core arguments of our draft paper, which is co-authored by me and Dr. V. Matthew Kurian, Joint Director, K.N. Raj Center, MGU University. So the aim of this presentation is to improve the paper based on all of your comments, and therefore the same are earnestly solicited. So let me share my screen now. I just have one slide that is showing the outline of my presentation. Okay, so let me start. The COVID pandemic has resulted in unprecedented increase in unemployment worldwide. And International Organization for Migration argue that migrants are particularly vulnerable to such economic impacts of COVID. Migrants, and especially international migration, and remittances sent by immigrants from Kerala play an important role in Kerala economy and society. Given the importance of immigration to Kerala economy and society, it's clear that if COVID adversely affects Kerala's immigration scenario, it will have adverse consequences for Kerala. So, we are trying to assess the possible impact of COVID-induced crisis on Kerala's immigration scenario. And as I mentioned, this paper is only an overview about that issue. Our assessment is based on information from International Organization for Migration, World Bank, and few available literature on COVID migration nexus. These available literature argues that migrants are more likely to work in sectors which are unfavorably affected by COVID-induced economic crisis. Sectors specifically mentioned in the relevant literature include food and hospitality, retail or wholesale trade, tourism, transport, and manufacturing. Many of these sectors, especially trade, transport, food, and hospitality, are among the major sources of employment to immigrants from Kerala. So, at the outset, it's likely that COVID-induced crisis will lead to either loss of employment or worsening of employment conditions for a substantial section of immigrants from Kerala. The second aspect that is mentioned in literature and relevant to Kerala's scenario is the role of informality. COVID-induced unemployment spike is particularly high in informal sector. Informal workers can be easily fired at a time of economic crisis, and as they are less protected by labor laws and other contractual agreements. Unfortunately, most of the immigrants from Kerala, especially the unskilled or semi-skilled immigrants, are informally employed. And this also increases the vulnerability of immigrants from Kerala to COVID-induced economic crisis. The third aspect that is discussed in the literature on COVID migration nexus is that of immigration policy related changes. COVID has created restrictions and difficulties in the process of immigration. Almost all countries in the Middle East, which is a major destination of immigrants from Kerala, have introduced travel restrictions in the wake of COVID. At the same time, in order to meet the increased demand for migrant workers in COVID-related tasks like healthcare sector, sanitation, etc., many destination countries have increased the flexibility of their immigration-related rules and formalities. For example, United Arab Emirates, a major destination of immigrants from Kerala, have simplified the visa extension process, and similar steps are also taken by destinations like UK and Australia. Thus, immigration-related policy changes during COVID possess both opportunities and challenges for Kerala. On one hand, there are chances of travel restrictions and other immigration restrictions in the destinations. On the other hand, COVID control measures in destination may result in new employment opportunities for immigrants from Kerala. But we have to keep in mind that these employment opportunities are risky in nature due to the very nature of COVID pandemic itself. The fourth aspect that is mentioned in COVID migration literature is the role of educational qualification of migrants. IOM pointed out that migrants with a better education, skills, experience are less affected by COVID-induced crisis. Many of the employment opportunities that are available to migrants in the field of COVID control demand better qualification, skills, and experience. This aspect is generally unfavorable to Kerala's immigration scenario, as majority of immigrants from Kerala are disadvantaged in this regard. But immigrants from Kerala who are having better qualification, skills, and experience, especially healthcare professionals, may benefit in this scenario. Now, if we look at the issue of COVID, or if we look at the issue of effect of COVID on Kerala's immigration scenario, the most simple question will be asked. It will be probably, will COVID-induced crisis in destination lead to massive return immigration to Kerala? IOM argues that COVID need not result in massive return immigration to origins. Their argument of IOM is in this manner. Even though unemployment increase among immigrants, they will try to stay in their respective destinations as they are not sure about a re-entry after an exit. So naturally, the question will be, what about the large number of return immigration that occurred to Kerala as a part of Vande Bharat mission? The answer is this. Return immigration to Kerala remained high even during non-crisis situation. And this is not our argument. This argument is already proved by literature on this aspect. Why? Because governments in Gulf countries, the major destination of immigrants from Kerala, do not generally encourage permanent settlement of immigrants. So immigrants return to Kerala and subsequently they re-emigrate, maybe after renewing their employment contract or in that manner. So the point is that re-immigration is a phenomenon that is not endemic to crisis situation. Re-immigration remains substantial even in non-crisis situation also. Thus, all recent return immigration to Kerala in the COVID period need not be due to employment loss due to COVID alone. So, COVID alone need not cause massive return immigration to Kerala. I stress the point, COVID alone. But IOM warned that COVID is likely to cause a dent on a pivotal factor in Kerala economy, that is inward international remittance. This inward international remittance is constitute more than 30% of Kerala's NSDP, and about 1/3 of the households in Kerala are determined on this inward international remittance. So the statistics from IOM prove that 20 countries with 55% of COVID cases sent 54% of global remittances. And due to COVID-induced crisis among migrants, global remittances are expected to decline by 20%. And IOM particularly pointed out that remittances to India are expected to decline by 23%. This means that international remittances to Kerala are also expected to decline. And this development will have adverse consequences for Kerala economy and society. So naturally, the policy interventions to reduce such possible unfavorable impacts of COVID on Kerala's immigration scenario are needed. IOM particularly pointed out that social protection systems play an important role in reducing the unfavorable impact of COVID to migration scenarios of individual origins. And fortunately, the government of Kerala has started in the right direction here by providing free ration and introducing various schemes for rehabilitation of returned immigrants like Dream Kerala project. Let us hope that these steps will help to wither the COVID-induced problems in Kerala's immigration scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raju John. I think very aptly you have shown light on the vulnerabilities of migrants from Kerala. And when we talk about the returning migrants from the Gulf countries, I think Kerala definitely constitute one of the very, very important states, and very nice presentation. And I'm sure there must be various questions lined up, which we may take up during Q&A session. So what I will do that our next presentation is next presentation is of Ms. Chitra Natarajan. Is Chitra has Chitra joined? Ms. Chitra joined? Hello? Chitra Natarajan. Yes, yes. Our next presentation is by Chitra Natarajan. He is a non-resident fellow, Middle East Institute, New Delhi. And the topic he would be presenting on is risk of health and safety in labor camps and working sites among migrant workers in Gulf countries amid spread of COVID-19. Very, very important topic. And yes, we are looking forward to hearing to you, Mr. Chitra Natarajan.
Thank you, Dr. Smita, the organizers, the technical team, for giving this opportunity to express my views and observations of the Indian migrants in Gulf. Good morning, everyone. Since pandemic, we hear and read the plights and exodus of migrant workers in urban India. Similarly, the migrant workers in the Gulf states were severely crippled by the impact of COVID pandemic and closure of economies and the international borders. So it's, let me share my screen, excuse me. Yeah. Can you see? Can you see my screen?
No, it's not clearly visible. I
Can you
don't.
see?
Yeah. Now it is visible. Yes,
Yeah.
Mr.
Thank you. So it's a huge crisis the Indian migrants are facing, but I would like to address the key issues pertaining to the present situation. So I would like to touch upon the pre-existing or persisting vulnerabilities, the pandemic perils, and the role of source and the host countries and the international organizations with a few policy recommendations. So when we look into the GCC countries, which started to diversify their economy, it attracted huge foreigners to work in different sectors because of the less population of the native citizens. India is one among the major labor-centering countries. Because of the higher dependence on labors from different countries, the GCC has made a very stringent labor laws. And because of this COVID pandemic, which pushed to lockdown and closure of economies, the Indian migrants, they lost their jobs, did not get their salaries, along with deteriorating living and working conditions. So under such circumstances, the international organizations, the NGOs, and the Indian government, along with the GCC states, have declared few safety measures for the migrant workers. Coming to the persisting vulnerabilities, the more common practice in GCC states is to have a kafil, that is a sponsor. It can be an individual or a company to bring in a foreign migrant worker in the state, mainly on a contract basis, which can be renewed and or can be terminated. So it's a kind of a temporary migration, which leads the migrants to return back once they're done with the GCC countries. And because of this sponsorship system, it gives more leverage for the kafil to take control of the migrants. For example, the unlawful confiscation of passports and filing absconding charges, etc. Though majority of the Indians, they migrate through proper channel, there are many who goes on a visit visa and try to get work permit or residence permit upon reaching the destination. If they could not accomplish it, they tend to be illegal residents. The other major problem faced by the migrants is through the recruiting agents who are mostly unregistered or having sub-agents with higher charges, and in most cases, trafficked women migrants through informal network of recruitment. So upon landing, there arise other problems of contract switching, trading, wage theft by the employers, poor working and living conditions. Though such unlawful activities are happening to the migrant workers, the labor laws or the legal systems in GCC are totally unsupportive. Adding to the above issues, the nationalization of the workforce initiated by the GCCs, they grabbed the opportunities available for the Indian migrants. So I would say that the pandemic compounded the pre-existing vulnerabilities for the millions of the migrant workers in the region. Since the start of the pandemic, thousands of migrant workers have been repatriated to India, many of them hurriedly and without proper protocol in place. And taking the advantage of this mass deportation moves, many employers who terminated their workers without paying them their legitimate wages, compensations, and benefits, leaving hundreds of Indian workers returning empty-handed. As per the contract signed, the employer has to give the end of service or the gratuity benefits, air tickets for return if they complete the contract. But it is not done during the pandemic. And among the Indian migrants, the worst affected are those in the sectors of construction, airports and service sectors, health workers, and domestic helpers. So when we divide the migrants into those who have already completed the contract and about to get it renewed or closed, their end of service benefit or the air ticket or the other remunerations were not paid. Similarly, those who have just arrived before the pandemic, they are the worst affected because of the higher recruiting charges for which they have mostly borrowed and could not get the promised job or salary in the Gulf. So they are luring in Gulf without job or salary. So all the GCC countries have no health insurance coverage for its migrants to access the public or private hospitals. And particularly during this pandemic period, the migrants, they can access hospitals only in the afternoon when it is reserved for locals in the morning. So this has accumulated or denied the access for migrants for health benefits. And the most vulnerable situation is the absconding charges or the runaway complaints against the workers by the employers, which halted the repatriation of them by the authorities. And many governments, where many GCC states were given the rights to complain absconding charges or hurub against the workers who has not complied or who has not followed the rules or abused or faced any problem with the employer. Coming to the living condition. Looking into the living condition, most of the labor camps were crampy, with more number of workers per room, leading to a higher rate of COVID-19 infection. And most of them were unable to access the medical care. The number of COVID-19 tests done on workers were very minimal. And those were taken for testing were mainly relocated, or they were taken to the makeshift centers or detention centers or deportation centers where the condition of the living space was very, very unhygienic without the basic amenities provided to them. So as part of the contract, every migrant is entitled for food and accommodation allowance, but it is denied since pandemic set in. Adhering the rules, the government authorities, they disconnected the water and the electricity for those accommodations, which is crowded without giving any alternate housing facilities. So this has compounded to the migrants to live in cramped rooms. So this social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic had caused an increase in stress, anxiety, depression, and generating an urgent need to manage the lack of access to mental health care therapy and treatment. So coming to the role of different stakeholders, when we look into the host countries, the GCC countries, they have given impunity mainly to the employers. So they have given the right to lay off for the employers in all over the GCC countries. But at the same time, they have given access or they have given the time to renew or extend their visas or work permit and residence permit. Coming to Bahrain, which it has given amnesty, the visit visa. In practice, however, the amnesty only pardons fines levied for expired work permits. So migrants, but with absconding charges and travel bans, are still not allowed to leave the country. Those who have worked with their employer for less than a year are still not allowed to change jobs without the employer's consent, even if they're victims of wage theft or abuse. So they are not covered under the amnesty. And UAE, they have announced for an early leave. That means the worker can leave early and come back to UAE with a consent with the employer, taking into account not breaking the earlier contract which was signed with the employer. Similarly, Saudi Arabia, they had extended the visit visa and the residence permit, while Oman had involved in aggressive nationalization of the workforce, not getting or not wooing the migrant workers. They have entered into the nationalization of its workforce. But Qatar has influenced 75 billion riyal of stimulus package for those companies who has to pay the migrant workers their salaries and other remunerations. And Kuwait also has announced amnesty and special flights to repatriate migrant workers. And coming to India, the major origin country, it has repatriated most of the migrants through the Vande Bharat mission under the Ministry of External Affairs. And the mission is in its sixth phase, which ends in October 24. Also, it has announced Swadesh, a joint initiative of the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, the Ministry of Civil Aviation, and the Ministry of External Affairs. It is aimed to create a database of qualified citizens based on their skill sets and experience to fulfill the demand of Indian and foreign companies, but no clarity whether unskilled workers under ECR category is recorded or not. So in April 2020, a coalition of 16 NGOs and trade unions, they co-signed letters and sent to the Gulf states calling on them to take steps to ensure that migrant workers receive adequate protection from COVID-19. So with all this persisting and pandemic problems, I would like to suggest few policy initiatives to make the Gulf migration a more safe and easy corridor. Looking at the recent steep oil price decline and the reforms to pivot the economy away from the hydrocarbon revenues, several economic diversifications of Gulf real estate's mega projects, close to 1.6 trillion of investments, including the Vision 2013 Saudi Arabia, Silk City in Kuwait, Lusail City and stadiums for 2022 World Cup in Qatar, and Duqm Port in Oman, and Expo 20 in UAE. Experts and economists project for a big demand in labor market. While world economies have slowly started to open and contain the COVID impact, remigration to the GCC is far largely expected. So it is high time we reframe the laws and policies to promote and protect Gulf migration. So as a country of origin, being a major source of a country of migrants, India has to take a bold step towards the safety and protection of its migrants. Under Vande Bharat mission, only a quarter of those applied for repatriation were lifted, leaving a huge number of applicants still waiting to return home. So steps has to be taken to repatriate the stranded migrants. And based on the travel history proof, I would suggest that the Indian government should announce an economic package for returned migrants to save them from the debt bondage. And under the safety net policy, self-employment schemes has to be announced for returned migrants or to be absorbed into the labor market. Also, I imply on an MOU to be signed with the GCC on easing the process of recruitment by shifting to e-recruitment. Along with all this, and the Indian missions abroad has to be equipped with programs and personnel to address the migrant issues, and the government has to frame a separate migration policy for ECR category. From the destination side, the GCC should scrap all the recruiting charges, which falls on the migrants' shoulder to encourage remigration, as we said that there is a huge demand for laborers. Also, looking at the nature of development model, I would suggest that the GCC country should frame a similar labor law to avoid confusions among foreign labor migration. And the kafala system of recruitment has to be completely reformed to liberalize the labor market. There is a dire need to build more spacious labor camps and a mandatory COVID-19 insurance for health. and travel has to be made for the migrants. With this, I end my talk. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Chitra, for a nice presentation. I think you have rightly brought in front about the health risk of the migrants, and I think it is very pertinent that when this lockdown and this all pandemic started, the first thing is that the migrants, those who have come from outside, just first cornered them into a crampy camps, and it is definitely going to add their health risk because they are not getting information inside, they are not allowed to go outside for their personal requirements. And what adds more to this is when they give a free hand to their employers, that they can take on and they can reduce their salaries, and all in the name of this pandemic. So yes, very rightly you have, and I think I also agree with many of your suggestions, what you have provided, though the feasibility of all these and how quick we can imply it's still a question. I think it is the migration involves the two points, like a source and a destination. So there is a need of a collaborated mechanism from the two sides because it's going to benefit both. So we will be looking at it on more and deliberate it on more during Q&A session. And I think I'll be inviting the next presenter. I would invite Dr. Kausar Fatima. I think she has some, though she was the last speaker, but she had some issues. So I just invite her earlier. She is Assistant Professor, History of AAM College Cluster, University, Srinagar. And her topic of the presentation is Religious Pilgrims and COVID-19 Challenges, Global Local Response, Structure between India and Iran. India and Iran and a religious perspective. It seems a very interesting presentation. So Dr. Fatima, it's all over to you. Dr. Kausar Fatima, have you joined? She has some connectivity issue, and when she joined, she requested to present it earlier. And I think just let me check once, otherwise we'll move to another presenter. Am I audible, Dr. Kausar Fatima? Are you there?
She is there, I think.
Hello.
Yeah, please start.
Yeah,
Dr. Fatima, please start.
A very good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Dr. Fatima from Srinagar, from the History Department. Thank you very much for providing me this opportunity. I hope my network is audible because we are on 2G, so I hope that it's audible.
Yes, it is audible. Please continue.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. My paper is actually Religious Pilgrims and COVID Challenges, Global Local Response Structure between India and Iran. So in this paper, actually, I want to discuss few questions, basically, that how India evacuated its pilgrims from Iran, and what are the main actors which played an important role in this evacuation process. And also that a question of Ladakh as a region, which became a UT recently. So in this context, I want to discuss the global pandemic situation and how Ladakh itself was going through the process of change from becoming a district to a UT. Union territory. So how this whole process changed and how the changed administration actually played a role in the evacuation of its people from Iran. So this whole process actually started with the banning of Indian flights from Iran and the closing of all international flights from Iran on the 28th of February 2020. So it was like almost 1 month before the national lockdown in India. So that actually creates a more interesting question, that why India did such a thing, and was there a proper data also with Indian government to show that the number of people who are coming back to India as religious pilgrims. So when you look at the data provided by the aviation sources, so they are saying that 350 Iranians are going back to Iran by the end of March, and only 250 Indians are coming back to India by the end of March. But if you just take the data of people from Ladakh, so government later realized that only 1,500 people from Ladakh itself are there as religious pilgrims. And because the number, so earlier they said that only 250, so they banned the airlines. So it is possible that the government thought that the number of people coming back in March is less. So they banned the air travel between India and Iran on that basis. And because of this, a lot of people in Iran faced problems of accommodation and health hazard also, because the city of Qom in Iran, where all these Indian pilgrims from Ladakh were staying, are actually, and maximum number of people are actually more than like the age group was above 50. So the problem with these in Ladakhi pilgrims was also that the COVID was affecting the older. As WHO said that the above 50s are more vulnerable, and maximum number of these pilgrims were actually above 50. So that also created panic, not only in the pilgrims in Iran, but also in Ladakh region itself, because many of the like families were worried about their parents and their grandparents, that what will be the situation. And second important thing during this whole evacuation process is that the Indian embassy in Iran was also not very clear about the situation. So many people or students who contacted Kashmiri students especially contacted the embassy, and they are saying that it's not an emergency situation, so we cannot evacuate you. So the Ministry of External Affairs guidelines to these embassies were also not very clear during the initial phase, which is like from 20th February to till 20th March. So there was no clear guidelines to the embassy people also, that what will happen to these people. Are we supposed to provide them help? Are they will be their own? So this also created interesting problem and study also, that why there was a lack of communication between the Ministry of External Affairs and the embassy people on the ground in Iran, when we already know that in Iran there was a large number of Indians already there as students, as workers, and as pilgrims also. So why the embassy was not having a clear instructions from India also. And another important point which highlighted in this paper is that the pilgrims from India, especially from Ladakh, were provided a boarding and lodging facility by the Iranian government, which the coordination committee of Ladakhi pilgrims are saying that they were provided by a food and lodging facility by the Iranian government, and the Indian government did nothing. So this also creates a question that why Indian embassy was not doing anything for these religious pilgrims, especially those who are coming from Ladakh. They are claiming. So I interviewed many of them, and they're saying that all the things were provided on behalf of the supreme leader of Iran. So they were provided good hotels, 5-star hotels, and free food and medical facility also, because many of them were senior citizens. So in all these processes, the role of Indian embassy is somehow missing in this particular case, I am saying, in case of the Ladakhi. So that also creates a question that why the embassy was not reaching out, when in India, the UT administration in Ladakh was in constant contact with the External Affairs Ministry for the evacuation of these people. And also in Ladakh, besides the UT administration, we also have a Autonomous Hill Development Council, which is an elected body. So in this particular case, both the Autonomous Hill Development Council of Kargil and Leh, the two regions, are putting more pressure on the administration, and the chairman of these council, especially from Kargil, because maximum number of people were from Kargil, so he was constantly in meet with the lieutenant governor and also the ministry officials that there should be provisions to bring back these pilgrims from Iran to India. And because of this situation, there were unfortunately 2 deaths in Iran of Ladakhi pilgrims and 2 deaths in Jaisalmer when the first batch was brought back by evacuating with the help of Indian Army. So 2 deaths happened in Iran and 2 deaths happened in Jaisalmer also of these pilgrims. And this actually created more pressure on the local elected body to do something. And finally, they threatened that all the elected bodies, whether it's the Hill Council or the Panch and Sarpanch or municipal councils, they will all resign if the government doesn't do anything to bring these pilgrims back to India. And because of this mounting pressure and the role played by these local bodies, that Indian government finally started the process of evacuating the Ladakhi pilgrims from Iran. And they said that they will do the testing. So that's also interesting that when they are bringing back the people from Iran, they said that they will bring the tests from they will collect this test samples in Iran and will do the testing in India, and then they will finally say that those who are negative will be brought back and those who are positive will have to stay back. So this whole process made very complicated, that rather than taking the help of Iranian government in doing the testing there only, the Indian government brought all these samples to India and then gave the test results also. So this created some kind of a panic situation also in the people, that they are like for 15 days, they don't know the result. And within this 15 days, everybody was, there was no segregation of who will be positive and who will be negative. So that created more fear among the people in Iran, that what will happen. And also the process. So when they brought back the first batch of evacuation, they were put in army facilitation centers in Jodhpur and Jaisalmer. And that also somehow created mental pressure on the pilgrims also, because first thing was that the temperature we all know that Ladakh is a cold region and the maximum temperature in Ladakh is just 30. That's the maximum. And so when you put these people to Jaisalmer and Jodhpur, the first thing that they faced the difficulty after all these struggle of coming back to India. So they faced the temperature. And second, most of the people were old age and they don't have the language also. So many of them don't even speak Hindi. So that lack of communication also put a lot of mental pressure on these. And because some of the pilgrims are saying that because of this mental pressure, a woman died of heart attack by thinking that she will never see her son and the grandson. So that was very tragic, because first, she doesn't know the army. In army facilitation centers, you cannot move freely. And second, in this hot temperature also, you feel that you are not going back to, because there was no hope of evacuating further from Jaisalmer to Ladakh. So that created further mental pressure on these evacuees. And that actually puts a question that during all these process, this paper actually wants to see that when you are seeing the pilgrims, number of religious pilgrims in Iran is from Ladakh region is very high. So during these kind of pandemic situation, so the response of Indian government is very interesting, that during the initial phase of pandemic, especially in case of Iran, there was some sort of urgency in Indian government's approach towards Iran, that they don't have a clear policy or guidelines or SOPs set. And we can say that the Indian government's approach is actually from urgency to gradual process of implementing finally the Vande Bharat mission, where you are clear that how you can bring back the citizens back to India. But during this particular phase of from Feb to March, there was a lot of uncertainties and there was a lot of confusion. And because of this confusion and uncertainties, for the first time, we can say that local bodies like hill councils also got the opportunity, in a way we can say, to interact and to see the functioning of Ministry of External Affairs. And because of this situation, they realized that they don't have any mechanism or any structure to address such pandemics situation, where there is the question of center-state relationship. So UT administration and the council also faced this inherent lack of direct contact with the center, and that also created a lot of confusion and tension in the region also. Another point which has to be made is the
Dr. Fatima, just a second, you just have 2 minutes.
Yeah. So I'm just concluding. So what I'm trying to say in this paper is actually that because of this pandemic situation, not only the financial part, because for the charges or the expense was paid by the Hill Development Council of Kargil, all the expenses were taken by them, not by the government of India or the center. So the region already gets a very limited number of funding, and because of these pandemic situation, rather than spending on developmental issues, the council has to spend a large chunk of its fund on the evacuation process and maintaining the facilities back in the region. Second point is that there is no, because the UT administration is new, there is no concrete or there is no clear-cut institutions in place in Ladakh in case of these kinds of emergency, and that also delayed the process of evacuating Ladakhis from Jaisalmer back to Ladakh region also, that they don't know what to do about a crisis like this. And the last conclusion which I want to say is that this particular pandemic situation, especially in case of pilgrims, religious pilgrims, also highlighted that there is some kind of policy lack in Indian government's approach towards these, because Indian government earlier did all the evacuation process from war zones, not in such situations. So they are not very much prepared, or they don't know, they don't have any policy guidelines that what to do in such a pandemic situation in terms of religious pilgrims. Thank you so much, ma'am, for providing me this opportunity, and I will look forward for the questions also. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima. In fact, very, very interesting insights and very different perspective in terms of religious pilgrims. And you have raised a lot of questions and to the government. And in fact, during Q&A session, we will have more deliberation on it, and I would particularly interested in understanding what sort of suggestions you would prescribe to deal with the situation or the crisis which we have just discussed. So looking forward for the Q&A session for all these. And right now I'll be inviting the next presenter, Dr. Munir Ilat. Dr. Munir Ilat is a assistant professor sociology in University of Allahabad. His topic of presentation is learning frugality and while being grounded in reality. reimagining economic and social life among Kerala's Gulf migration, the era of pandemic. I mean, the topic sounds abstract as well as very concrete, and I think Dr. Ilat would be the best person to express that what exactly does it represents. And one more presentation we are going to have on Kerala's Gulf migration. So looking forward. Dr. Ilat, over to you. You are not audible. Dr. Munir Ilat, you are not audible. Rakesh, have you made him co-host? He is unable.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you are audible now.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay.
Please continue.
Thank you, Smita and other organizers, Lirar, Divya, all. This is, as you said, it is abstract and to some extent concrete. I have put it in this way to understand the kind of migrant narratives that I have received from as a form of kind of self-reflections from the Gulf migrants who have been to Gulf for long years. Probably if you look at Gulf migration from India, it starts from Kerala, especially from the Malabar coast, where actually I did my study and actually I hail from. So what does this crisis, or return or pandemic mean to those migrants who have created a dynamic space between Gulf and the homeland for a long year? See, some of the informants or respondents whom I have met in the in this the study area. So what they have actually said that we have undergone many such pandemic crisis situations, including the 1991 Gulf repatriation from Kuwait due to Iraq-Kuwait war, and after that there is a kind of legal measures taken by the Gulf countries where their liberal entry and accommodation or engagement, economic engagement, has been restricted to a great extent. So, like what we call nitakas, that is one form. But what I have found from the self-reflection of this migrant is something that goes beyond this. I'm not denying the issues with regard to the labor and the kind of human rights violations, but also we have to look into the kind of migrants who have effectively engaged with the Arabs, their kafils for long period, and have become successful entrepreneurs over a period of time. Probably we have not heard much from their narratives, and I'm trying to look into that. So when we look at pandemic or this COVID pandemic, see, I spoke to them, so I was really worried, I'm anxious about what they are actually going to do after some time, because many of them will be coming back to their rural hinterlands of Malabar. So what will they do? So many of them were not really perturbed by this kind of situation. What they were telling that, see, for us, migration is not an abrupt thing or is something that happened in a day or two. Some of them, some of them are third generation migrants that their grandfather have migrated to the Gulf by using all illegal means to reach the Gulf in 1950s. I have the case of Ali Kuti Haji. He died recently. As part of my earlier study, so I met him. So he was telling the kind of illegal means that they have adopted to reach the Gulf, and he made actually money. So the culture of migration, the culture of money making, culture of re-engagement with the people and the cultures of the Arab land needs to be accentuated when we speak about the way they actually respond to such kind of pandemic. So somewhere along the line, I'm trying to make a point: the diversity of migrants, rather than talking about going to Gulf and they are thrown out. There is kind of job theft or coming back, but so in that sense, they have been to that Gulf for long years, and they have actually not treated Gulf as the ultimate destination. Some of them have come back and actually diversified their economic activities while being closely related to their sponsors and other groups. So this, Malabar area has a strong and dynamic engagement with the Gulf countries and the people around, which has actually made at least some of them to make money. So this is the context in which I will be speaking about this. Let me read the main point of or debate of my presentation so that you will understand this. So the growing number of returned immigrants from the countries of Gulf Cooperation Council owing to multiple interrelated causalities in the era of COVID-19 pandemic, the traditional Gulf pockets in the hinterlands of Malabar are bustling with new era of return preparedness with deep anxieties, uncertainties, and new ray of hope. So it's not that they are anxious and they have lost their jobs, they are sitting at home, they are sitting idle, they are not doing anything. Many of them are just like any other migrant labor who is unskilled and do not have much idea about what is happening in the Gulf, do not have much idea about the cultural realities in the Gulf. They come back and they have lost their job and they are the real vulnerable people. But I'm talking about another kind of migrant labor force who have a long history of going there and engaging with the Gulf countries, who have actually a long history of return preparedness. And that return preparedness is positive and dynamic, where the self-reflection of some of the return immigrants due to COVID situation revealed that return and re-migration have become part of their culture, like the rite of passage. Now, if you look at anthropological studies that they have studied extensively about the rite of passage. So, migration has become part of their culture. It actually flows through their blood. And in such situation, this kind of uncertainties or crises are easily overcome. And Gulf migrants have successfully overcome many uncertainties in their long and frequent journey between between the homeland and the Gulf. So the interview carried out among the respondents invariably sounded that new economic situation will have to be dealt with at utmost care and calculations. It is learned that they have adapted to such uncertainties, that they have already taken a step backward and learned the lessons of frugality. See, they learned the lessons of frugality means there could be situations and time when many of their avenues of money making might have actually curtailed due to many structural issues, and that could be because of the legal measures that the Gulf countries have taken, or because of the kind of abrupt situations like the new pandemic. So what I have found that the study conducted in one of the traditional Gulf pockets of southern Malabar signals a well-entrenched trajectory of cultural interaction with the Gulf, wherein a steady and strong breed of entrepreneurs have effectively expanded and diversified their business activities, even overcoming many adversities. So their story draws close to, this is the kind of theoretical part I wanted to speak on. The Scandal and Massey have actually looked into this in the case of Mexico, that international migration becomes deeply rooted, that the prospect of transnational movement becomes normative. So I'm talking about that kind of people who have at least 50 years of migration. I'm talking about the single person, but the community as such. So they have learned, they have actually moved from a typical kind of uneducated, unemployed workforce to a recent nascent middle class, having many facilities and strong engagement with the global horizons of economic engagement started from the Gulf, and they have not restricted their economic engagement to the Gulf. Rather, they have diversified to new other areas within India or places like European countries, Southeast Asian countries, both in terms of travel as well as settlement. So this is where I wanted to make a point that the historical evolution of migrant workforce from Kerala to the Gulf in terms of its profile, characteristics, and pattern reminds us of a shift from casual, unskilled, and semi-skilled workforce and less mobile workforce to a dynamic, self-employed, and professional labor force capable of tapping economic opportunities and exploring new possibilities of money making. I have self-reflection of some of these migrants. Probably, if time permits, I'll speak about 4 or 5, or at least 1 or 2 cases. I can definitely, if the chair permits, I can.
Only 2 minutes. I would
about.
Request you, Munir. Only 2 minutes because
Okay.
we need to bind up it
So
by
if
1.
If that is the case, okay. So let me speak about, for instance, a person called Shah Jahan, okay? And he is in his late 40s, recalls his father's return from Kuwait in 1991, owing to outbreak of the Kuwait-Iraq war and subsequent repatriation of many migrant workers, including his father, to the homeland. So it was with the handsome compensation offered by the then Kuwait government to all its repatriates that Shah Jahan's father opened a vegetable shop in the Kuwait city 2 years later. Now Shah Jahan not only maintains the shop that his father had set up, but also is proud owner of 5 shops in different parts of the country. So it is to be remembered that while many Kuwait expatriates spend the booty they received as compensation due to Gulf War for constructing houses and spending on marriages, migrant entrepreneurs like Shah Jahan use his opportunity to diversify his business ventures by developing new skills and earning new experience of doing business. Apart from his business avenues in the Gulf, he has set up new confectionery shops in 2 prominent towns of Tamil Nadu. So this is what I'm trying to make a point, that when we look at return migrants as a category, we also have to think about the dynamism involved within that group and how they have actually effectively re-engaged with the host countries. So let me conclude by saying that the dynamic migrant communities emerged in the interior Malabar are a product of protracted struggle for existence and economic agency. Their toil, perseverance, and commitment to explore newer avenues of money-making have, in the past too, met many adversities and structural bottlenecks, which they have effectively overcome over the years. So this is actually making a point that contemporary migration is embedded in a set of relationships, an organization of a set of phenomena with one another. This is to say that migration is embedded in economic pursuit, ferocious attempt to improve social status, and urge to come out from the routine social disrecognition to a kind of dynamic agency of migrants, both in their homeland as well as in the host countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Munir, for providing such in-depth insights about the evolution of migration from Malabar to Gulf countries. I think we will have a lot of questions during Q&A session and much more deliberation on it. So because of the paucity of time, I would request presenters to take 7 to 8 minutes and try to wind up their presentation. Next, I am inviting Dr. Sonal Thakkar, and she is Associate Professor and Head of Sociology, MES College, Zuari Nagar, Goa. And her topic of presentation is impact of reverse migration on home communities. Very interesting seems, and since morning I think this is one of the key issue which we have been discussing, that so much migrants are coming back home, and how would they are going to affect the people or the economy back home. So Dr. Thakkar, it's over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
And can you all see my PPT?
Yes, it's visible. Please continue.
Okay, yeah. Now the topic of my paper today is impact of reverse migration on home communities. A visible fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic is reverse migration, which experts say could end up being hard to reconcile with, given the importance of migration to the Goan economy. Remittances are the only source of livelihood. The objective of this paper is to examine the impact of this migration on the Goan community amidst the global pandemic, and to understand the present scenario, it's pertinent to trace the history of migration of Goans, to identify the problems faced by the returned migrants, to analyze the effect on the households due to the return of the menfolk, to study the impact on interpersonal relationships of community. I have to run through some slides. The description of Goa. Very important fact is Goa had been ruled by Portuguese for 401 the longest on the Indian subcontinent from 1510 to 1961. This is the map, administrative map of Goa. Sorry.
Dr. Thakkar, you're not audible.
A very notable feature is, yes, a very notable feature has been the old and new conquest.
It seems that we have lost connection with Dr. Sonal Thakkar. Yeah, she is back. Please unmute yourself. Dr. Sonal Thakkar, please unmute yourself. Dr. Thakkar, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, I can. Yeah, the net is fluctuating just right now. Okay, so the majority of migrants came from the old conquest. There was massive migration of labor and middle classes to the erstwhile British and Portuguese empires. This is the map showing the old and new conquest. The new conquests are marked in blue and the pink are the old conquests. Okay. Then I'll skip this slide. Now the causes of migration, it began from the 16th century. That's the record that we have as a response to the pathological conditions prevalent at that time. First, it was to escape conversion and flee from the terror of Inquisition. Then the agrarian economy and subsistence farming was another reason. Unemployment, harsh taxes added to the problem. So this deep fear and acute need could be described as the precipitating factors of migration. Much later, the increase in transport and communication facilitated migration, and many desired that their children should get better educational prospects, so they migrated. So the trajectories of movement in the colonial period, by and large, it was to British India and Asia, and any migration from Goa, I must mention over here, prior to 1961 was international migration because we were a part of the Portuguese colony. Then in the 20th century, the sailors, Tarvoti, okay, seamen, then post-decolonization, and that is 1947 for the whole of India, and post-liberation 1961. Many went to Portugal, UK, Brazil, New Zealand, Australia, USA, Gulf countries. And since 2000, Goans have been acquiring a Portuguese passport so they can freely move to any of the European countries. Now the culture of migration, this need-based movement has become a customary practice. So see, the migration has been for 500 years, and many villages in Goa, they have a sizable number of men who have migrated overseas. The youngsters have followed the path chalked by the elders, and these group habits have become folkways. Goans are dominated by a desire for a better lifestyle, secure better wages, and upward mobility. Now this migration is a sort of a rite of passage to adulthood, and staying at home would smack of failure. Families are accustomed to absence of fathers. There is anticipatory socialization of the young girls and boys. Boys see that their uncles, fathers have gone away, and it has enhanced the family's social status. And also young girls, they are conditioned and groomed to accept conjugal separation. Now, district-wise, why I chose this particular Salsett Taluka and the villages over there. North Goa immigrant households are only 33.8 and South Goa 66.2. And then I have chosen Salsett Taluka. South Goa has 66, I mentioned. And I've chosen Salsett where 50% of the households have a person who has overseas. Now the method of study, 7 villages from Salsett Taluka are chosen. 24 families were identified as units of observation. Usage of questionnaires to elicit data from the respondents. Formal discussions with religious heads, sarpanch, village leaders, etc. Household case study method and in-depth personal interviews. And informal discussions were held with the youth. Now the major findings, pre-COVID-19 pandemic, Goa has had a culture of migration, and there has been an ostentatious display of wealth, construction of bigger houses, similar to the Kerala model, and consumerism has been the hallmark of the migrants' families. And also the youth opt for tourism and hotel industry related professions, so they will have better opportunities when they go overseas. Now the major findings, impact on the return migrant. Return migrants were treated with disdain and stigmatized when they came to Goa. The physical isolation, quarantine, ended after a stipulated period, but the social isolation continues. Downward social mobility has occurred in many households due to the abrupt stoppage of remittances. In addition, there is a loss of status in the homes and villages. Return migrants do not have savings to fall back on, and retirement plans have gone haywire. Mounting debts, deferred payment of EMIs has caused immense worry. Lack of alternate gainful employment in hometowns and villages has led to physical and mental health issues. People have started selling miscellaneous stuff on roadsides, leading to occupational degradation. Many have resorted to selling of household gadgets and appliances, pawning of jewelry and so forth in exchange of disposable cash. So this is the scenario. Impact on the household expenses are unmanageable. Inflation adds to the problem. Purchasing power has been affected. Lifestyle and consumption has spiraled downwards. Healthcare worries. Education of children is disrupted. And the brunt of discontinuation of studies is borne mainly by the girl child. And burden of online education, this is an unanticipated expense. Now the impact on social relationships. Since the family budget has gone haywire and remittances are abruptly discontinued, man was earlier the sole bread earner. Now there are conflicts as authority figure and role as a provider is lost. I'm very sorry about this. Please excuse me. Please pardon me, I live alone and it's very hard when such things happen. There is a role reversal for women as they take up odd jobs to make ends meet. then this has led to breakdown of interpersonal relationships. Now, impact on the home communities. There is a crisis in the global world and job market has shrunk. Youth who used to look up to the migrants as heroes and indulged in overt anticipatory socialization, they wanted to replicate their success story in the UAE. Return migrants are no longer role models worth emulating, as their failure stories predominate their narrative of the hardships endured overseas and the difficult journey made homewards. For youngsters aspiring to go overseas, their dream to go abroad only are upended and they are searching alternate career paths. Now the impact on the state. Overseas migration had created a vacuum in Goa, which is being filled by migrants from other parts of the country. So see the paradox here. Return migrants are bystanders as they don't fit in the system. The state is overwhelmed with the twin burden of unemployment as well as limited resources. And conclusion, reverse migration could have far-reaching ramifications on Goans who may have to relocate to Goa. Getting gainful employment may pose to be a big challenge. Also, coping with a fall in living standards due to less salary would be another pitfall. It would mean a return to a life from which many have severed their umbilical ties. Those who opt to travel to seek employment in other European countries will have to start afresh and probably face the problem of getting a foothold in alien lands. The complete repercussions of this reverse migration, which are yet to be fully experienced, shall be borne not only by the migrants themselves, but also by their families. This situation is a serious challenge for the return migrants in particular and the Goan society in general. Thank you. And I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present my paper.
Thank you, Dr. Sonal Thakkar. A very insightful and realistic presentation you made. In fact, we all are many a times get this carried away with the success story of the migrants, but you have very correctly shown the picture of the other side, that many a times they are no longer the role model, and the failure stories of the migrants are equally pertinent. So we will look forward to you for having question answer session. And for my next presentation, I would be inviting, I think we have the last presentation by I invite Dr. Monica Best Ranjan. She is a research fellow at the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, New Delhi. And she would be presenting impact of COVID-19 on student mobility, a case study of India. Again, a very different and refreshing perspective. So Dr. Monica, over to you. Looking forward to hearing from you. Monica, are you there? Unmute yourself, Dr. Monica, please unmute yourself. Rakesh?
Hello?
Yes, yes, you are audible now.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, Monica, you are audible. Please continue.
Sorry, ma'am.
Not at all.
Sorry for the event. So, shall I start my presentation?
Yes, yes, sure. We all are waiting.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Smita ma'am. My PPT is visible to all of you?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. So, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, especially Dr. Lirar sir and Dr. Divya Balan madam, and chair of this session, Dr. Smita Tiwari madam, for giving me this opportunity to present on this very important topic of mine, that is student mobility today. My fellow panelists have already covered many important areas, particularly in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. So I will be presenting on student mobility today, and the topic is impact of COVID-19 on student mobility, a case of India. So due to the pandemic-led lockdown, several dimensions of higher education, primarily student mobility, institutional close down, curriculum, coursework, examinations, as well as academic and research staff have been affected not only in India but at the global level also. Therefore, based on the anecdotal evidence, primarily online news and articles, I will discuss about the impact of COVID-19 on both global higher education in basically the student sending countries and the recipient countries situation. So in view of this, my discussion covers following two core areas of higher education, that is globalization of higher education, and second is the student mobility. So first is I would like to briefly discuss about the globalization of higher education. And so as all of us are aware that globalization of higher education is a market mediated process which has made higher education a tradable or sellable activity. So in this context of globalization, the higher education has become a good, a commodity to meet the requirements of the global knowledge economy. And it is, since it is provided by the both public and private players to the mass students, therefore the role of both public and private players have become pertinent in context of the knowledge economy. So when we talk about the global higher education, the general agreements in trades and services framework have become very important to know, because GATS framework has classified education into four modes, that is cross-border supply, second is consumption abroad, third is commercial presence, and fourth is the presence of natural persons. I am discussing these things because it is the foundation or the theoretical ground to understand the student mobility in context of the COVID-19. So let me explain it briefly one by one. One is the cross-border supply. This framework includes the distance education, e-learning courses, franchises courses, and it somewhere affected poorly in the COVID-19 phase, because the number of courses and franchises are seen very in a very deteriorating condition. So the number of courses, franchises, and the e-learning programs could either be less or will cease to exist in post COVID-19 era. Second is the consumption abroad. So this include student mobility. And student community have been the largest chunk of like community, diaspora community, in terms of skilled workers, in terms of professionals, in terms of resource persons, researchers in destination countries. So student mobility have been the source of skilled workers and professionals, especially in the case of India, which helped to accelerate the economic growth of both home and as well as host countries. However, the cessation of student mobility in the COVID-19 situation could hinder the global demand and supply of students vis-a-vis talented workers in the near future. Third is the commercial presence. This mode include presence of the service providers in the host country, in the destination country. And it is in the form of branch campuses, franchises arrangements, and joint ventures with local institutions for the commercial purposes. So this is particularly for the profit-oriented activity comes into this mode. So the MOU between two institutions or between two countries for students and educational program exchange could also be predicted as affected in the near future after this COVID pandemic situation. Last but not the least, presence of natural persons. This mode includes the presence of persons, including professors, researchers, students, who temporarily travel from one country to another to provide their educational services. And the media reports, the international reports show that this is a bad phase for student exchange. That means the consumption abroad mode of global higher education globally. So now I will quickly come to the next part of my
Yeah, seems some technical difficulty at the end of Monica. We'll wait for a minute. Monica, can you hear us?
That is student mobility.
Yes,
the urgent
she's back. Monica, you're mute. Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are. Please continue.
So the bad internet connection today.
Yeah, it seems we all are victim of that.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. So I was talking about the students and in country in the world. Therefore, many in destination countries. Indian students got stuck in host countries due to immediate repatriation procedure done by the destination countries and the host home countries. And this led to the severe crisis in accessing basic needs, financial crunch, and survival difficulties for students in destination countries. Now, I would like to explain briefly about the issues and challenges faced by migrant students in the world. One is the effects of institutional closure worldwide. Basically, it has imposed strict orders on migrant students to vacate the hostels and return back to their home countries. This has led to the homelessness among foreign students in destination countries. They had to face difficulties for basic needs, and there are cases when students, and due to the transmissible nature of coronavirus, the students could not be able to withdraw money from ATM out of fear of infection. And secondly, most of the time, the ATMs were found cashless. Second is the students returned to the home countries. The home countries have sent back the foreign students to their home countries. Specifically, international migrant students have faced difficulties in host countries and challenges during repatriation process. There are many students who got stranded in the host countries due to immediate lockdown decision. And we have seen several media reports in the TV that the government of India made official request for deportation of its students who got stuck in the host countries, mainly in Malaysia and the Philippines. Therefore, the transition of students was full of anxiety, stress, and challenging. And such circumstances became crucial, very sensitive, and challenging for Indian government also. Next is the cost of education. It is a strong prediction that affordability of education will become a serious issue in the post-COVID-19 era. The cost of education will increase, and thus migrant students will be more affected because some of them will not be able to bear high tuition fees and educational expenses. Secondly, there will be fear and anger among students due to unequal distribution of educational facilities and denial of educational resources in destination countries. Thirdly, the quality of higher education could deteriorate due to changes in educational policies and regulatory framework worldwide. Next is the restrictions on immigration. It is an important aspect in context of student mobility because many countries have already restricted entry at their borders, and thus students' visas will become critical concern. The US President Trump has already restricted the H-1B visa temporarily. Most likely, the US and the many other countries will not renew the visa rules under the same conditions again. Next is the admission procedure. COVID-19 affected the admission procedure in a way that many global universities and institutes delay the award of high school diplomas or degrees. This in turn led to the late admission process, cessation of foreign students' entrance, and administrative issues, and that created challenges before admission system. In this emergency, students are not clear about the admission guidelines for their next semester or coursework. In context of Indian students, those who have decided to go abroad for higher studies, they had admission offers at the undergraduate and graduate levels, but they are waiting for an uncertain academic future. And the major problems happened with the class 12 students who have waited to complete their board exams for last 3 to 4 months. And it was a long wait for them to hear official guidelines from government about their board exams, as well as entrance come schedules in India. So some students waited for opening of visa offices to inquire about the issue of student visa. However, in between the time course, the foreign student universities gave two options. One, either delay the joining a semester, or second, to take online classes. And I'm not sure that how many students have opted either of the options. Sixth, crimes and racism with foreign students. This is a very sensitive area globally. The current situation predicts that there can be two aspects of crimes and racism in near future. One is the fear and threat among native students towards the foreign students, and they will consider them as outsiders. The cases of crimes and violence could happen again with foreign students. For instance, the case of racism against Chinese students had happened in the USA, where they have faced racial comments and slangs by the US citizens due to the news of coronavirus, which was allegedly emerged in the China. Next is the impact of jobs and internship offers. According to the IMF, the coronavirus induced global economic recession, which turned down the employment opportunities with deteriorating global market conditions. It was an official statement by IMF in April 4 to 2020. And several institutions are facing problems to safeguard placements and summer internships for students. The students who are studying in social sciences, humanities, and even linguistic courses, they will be facing difficult time for job opportunities more than technical and professional courses students. So let me conclude my presentation. Finally, I would like to say that just like virtual background of Zoom app, the online mode of education is temporary, but we need to strengthen it through better policies, resources, mechanisms for future. I'm saying this in context of the student mobility, because several students today are completing their coursework from the online channels. So in this circumstance, online cloud lauded this support, like smartphones, tablets, laptops, and not every parent in India can afford the luxury. And therefore, researchers and activists are saying that this step has violated the fundamental right of education in India. So there are many other issues faced by academic staff during this virtual media, such as online slangs and offensive behavior, overburden of administrative responsibilities. So with this, I would like to say that students are going through with similar situations in India as well as in abroad. So with this, I would like to thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for your wonderful insights on the student mobility during this time of COVID-19. I think we will quickly move to a Q&A session since we are really running short of time. So I would request Sarya, please take over and read out the questions you have collected from chat box and pose it to the speaker if it is directly marked to.
Thank you, ma'am. Due to the time constraints, we have to screen out the questions, and there's only one specific question to Dr. Chitra. This is from Rajashekhar Chapadi. Indian government provided for repatriation to NRIs through Vande Bharat mission. Those have money, they came back to India by buying tickets. Now the problem is poor workers who can't able to spend money to buy tickets. Still many were stuck there itself. Do you have any information how these people come back and how government will help these poor workers? Dr. Chitra?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Mostly, as you said it correctly, mostly who had financially well, they were able to buy the air tickets and they came back. But in a case of the migrant laborers who could not save money because they lost the job and who are already luring with debt bondage back home, the families, they entered in borrowing more money and sending them to buy air tickets so that they can come home to save their life and never to go back again. In the other case, few migrants are still waiting or surviving in the hope to get the economies to be opened and they can get new avenues for job and they can get absorbed into the labor market of the Gulf countries. So this is on part of the government side. We already have the Indian Community Welfare Fund, which is with the Ministry of External Affairs. But those were the fund, though it is for the welfare for the migrants, but it is given only for the deserving cases. But because of this pandemic, most of the migrants under the easier category, they went into the deserving cases. But now it is up to the government how to decide upon, how to use upon that a particular fund, the Indian Community Welfare Fund, to be used, whether to pay their tickets or to get them relieved from the clutches of the kafirs to get back them to home. Thank you.
Hello. Now we have one comparative question. It's an open one from Upasana Bhandari. Anyone can answer this. When raising awareness of migrant rights and obligations in Thailand, this project is a joint effort of IOM, the Ministry of Labor and National Human Rights Commission of Thailand. It seeks to improve the living and working conditions of migrants in Thailand by raising awareness about their rights and welfare among government officials, employers, and members of the migrant and host communities. But what is the condition in India, and what are the initiatives taken by the Indian government? Anyone can answer the question.
Any presenters who would like to take up this question? Because it is an open question for any of the presenters. And okay, I don't think any word, last word, if any presenter would like to speak on it.
Yeah, this is Chitra. There is one more query from Mr. Thampi Nagarjuna. Can I address
Yes,
that?
sure. But you have to repeat the question also. I mean, you have to read out the question. I mean.
Yeah, he has said that, Chitra, these are the continued for more than half century. What is your solution? And I'm the first and foremost founder of Legal Trade Union Gulf Kingdom of Bahrain. The failures are 90% from the sending countries, even without any accountability or audibility. Make the sending country to make proper education and behavior therapy to cope with the receiving countries. Yeah. Make sending countries to make proper education and behavior therapy to cope up with the receiving countries. And even no accounts how many died due to COVID in overseas. And these, okay, I think most of them are comments, but I would like to
you can provide a holistic, yes, brief answer. I mean, because we may not be able to go point wise, yeah, right now.
From the Lok Sabha proceedings from February 1 to August 25, the highest number of deaths were reported from Saudi Arabia, that is 2,360, and 1,441 from UAE, and 694 from Kuwait, 336 from Oman, 238 from Qatar, and 176 from Bahrain. Yes, these problems, what I have discussed, are already persisting, whether it is deteriorating living or working conditions, or the wage theft, or whatever it is that have discussed. But it has aggravated under the pandemic situations. Why we are saying it that it's a problem from dissenting countries? Yes, we did not sign the UN Convention, that is the International Convention for Protection of Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families in 2003. While major labor-sending countries have signed it, India as well as Gulf, we are signatories, but we did not ratify it. We have signed it, but we did not ratify this convention, which gives more protection to the laborers. And one more thing, though the government is giving so much of protection, like pre-departure training, or establishing overseas manpower corporation or national manpower expert promotion councils, but the citizens, the Indian migrants, they choose, very few of them, they choose a route of registered or legal migration phase, but most of them, they try to take up the illegal way, or the other way of getting into this Gulf migration corridor. So those who are entering into this illegal migration phase, they were the persons, or they were the main group who are being fallen to prey for such abuses, or whatever the situations that we are facing. So it is part of the individual a choice whether to go under a registered agent or the unregistered agent. So it is up to the citizens thing. Anyways,
Thank
the
you.
government has, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chitra. Thank you, Dr. Chitra Natarajan. So here we come to the end of this session, this academic session, and it has been really extremely enriching and engaging. Very nice presentation made by all the presenters. And as a takeaway, what we have been discussing since morning, that this COVID pandemic situation has created a kind of new normal where we have become relied on technology and other many things which was not very usually part of our life so closely. The question that remains to our mind, that whether these all are going to continue, whether are we going to live in this new normal situation forever, I don't know, because we are still, I believe that we are still in a transition period. We are still adapting to this new normal. And at the same time, we have also opened up to the old normals. What was the old? We are opening up gradually, with maybe with more precaution, maybe with more being careful. But what I see in the future, that there would be a combination of the two. There would be old normal as well as new normal, or we may say that old normal with new additions to that. So with that note, I would like to end this session here, and I would like to thank you all very much. And I'll ask Sairiak to take over and to end the session with a vote of thanks. Thank you all.
I take this opportunity to express a gratitude on behalf of the webinar coordinating team to Dr. Smita Tiwari from GRFDT, New Delhi, for chairing this session in a delightful manner. I also thank all the presenters for their excellent ideas and presentation, as it shed light on many thoughts and invoked many questions. I extend our gratitude towards all the attendees who made the session very vibrant through their thought-provoking questions. Now we are concluding this session, and the webinar will resume exactly at 4 p.m. with the fourth technical session. Thank you.
Chitra, Chitra, just I want to say hi. After a long time, I'm meeting you.
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. Actually, I had to rush somewhere. I couldn't, halfway I left from your paper, and I couldn't interact with you.
Yes, sir. I'll share the details with you, sir.
No issue. Will be in touch. Actually, I tried your phone also, but I think the number has changed.
Okay, sir. I'll reply to you, sir. I'll mail you, sir.
Okay.